Stop everything! A child's life is slipping away, and no one, no doctor, no nurse, not even the hospital director is willing to act. But she steps forward, risking her job, her safety, everything. And the billionaire watching, what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments below! And if you love stories that inspire and amaze, don't forget to subscribe and join our family, because you won't want to miss what happens next. The city's skyline gleamed under the early morning sun, the glass towers reflecting a world of wealth, power, and privilege. At the heart of it all stood St. Catherine's Hospital, a name whispered with reverence across the city's elite circles. It wasn't just a hospital, it was a fortress of luxury, with marble floors that shone like mirrors, crystal chandeliers hanging from soaring ceilings, and nurses moving with clinical precision through sterile, spotless corridors. For the rich and powerful, this place was nothing less than heaven. For the staff, it was a pressure cooker, a world where perfection was demanded at all times, and mistakes could ruin careers in seconds. Among the nurses walking briskly through the gleaming hallways was Amara Johnson. Her uniform was crisp, her ID badge gleaming under the hospital lights. But despite her polished appearance and years of dedication, she often felt invisible. Colleagues called her dependable. But few looked beyond her dark skin, her quiet demeanor, and her role as just a nurse. To many of the elite who roamed the hospital, she was barely a shadow on the marble floors, a faceless, nameless presence whose sole purpose was to obey, serve, and remain unseen. Amara, however, carried a strength that could not be ignored by those who truly mattered. Her eyes, warm, intelligent, and alert, missed nothing. She had a way of noticing the faintest change in a patient's condition, the almost imperceptible flicker of discomfort, the slightest irregularity in breathing. It was this attention to detail, this compassion, that had saved lives countless times, though rarely had anyone recognized it publicly. This morning, as Amara made her rounds in the pediatric ward, she noticed something unusual. In room 12B, a young boy named Ethan, 10 years old, from a poor neighborhood across the river, lay in his bed, clutching his chest and sweating profusely. His mother, exhausted from nights of worry, hovered beside him, whispering words of comfort that barely seemed to reach her child. Amara's instincts kicked in immediately. She bent down, checking his vital signs, noting the rapid pulse and shallow breathing. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She frowned, realizing this could escalate if not addressed immediately. But as she looked around for a doctor, she saw that the ward was unusually quiet, the staff occupied elsewhere. Distracted by the arrival of Mr. Harrington, the billionaire investor who had come to tour the new hospital wing, Mr. Harrington, a man in his late 50s with a tailored navy suit and an air of absolute confidence, was known across the city not just for his wealth, but for the way he wielded it. People often joked that he didn't walk. He claimed the floor beneath him bent to his will. Today, he was on a mission, inspecting every corner of the hospital while speaking in sharp, commanding tones to anyone in his path. "Why is this bed not perfectly aligned with the floor tiles?" he barked at a janitor, waving a manicured hand at the child's room door. "And why does this nurse look distracted? Isn't this supposed to be a 5-star facility?" The janitor, red-faced and trembling, mumbled an apology. Amara, meanwhile, stayed focused on Ethan, ignoring the billionaire's presence entirely. She adjusted the oxygen mask gently over his small face and spoke softly. "It's okay, Ethan. You're safe. We're going to fix this." But Mr. Harrington didn't care about safety. He didn't see a child in danger, he saw imperfection. He strode past Amara, glancing at her with a mix of disdain and impatience. "Make sure the hospital runs smoothly," he said, his voice dripping with authority. "I won't tolerate incompetence in my facility." Amara's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She had learned long ago that arguing with men like Harrington accomplished nothing. Instead, she focused on the child. She ran a quick check of his charts and realized the severity. Ethan was having a critical respiratory complication. Waiting for a doctor, even for a minute, could be catastrophic. Her heart pounded, not with fear for herself, but for the child in front of her. This was the moment where her training, her courage, and her humanity collided. She couldn't, would not, let bureaucracy, arrogance, or indifference cost a life. Yet around her the world continued as if nothing were happening. Other nurses whispered among themselves, glancing nervously at the approaching billionaire. Doctors lingered in the hallway, pretending to review charts while avoiding eye contact with Amara. No one moved. No one acted, and that's when Amara made a silent vow. "If no one else will act, I will." For a brief second, the room seemed suspended in time. Ethan's labored breathing filled the air. The smell of antiseptic mingled with the faint scent of his mother's perfume. Outside, the golden sunlight streamed through the hospital's expansive windows, highlighting the contrast between the world of wealth and the world of struggle within this very room. Amara's eyes hardened with determination. She gently adjusted Ethan's IV, checked his oxygen mask, and whispered, "Hold on, little one. I've got you." She glanced briefly toward the corridor, seeing Mr. Harrington now inspecting a nurse's station. The man was confident, powerful, untouchable, or so everyone thought. But Amara knew something he didn't. Courage doesn't come from wealth, titles, or privilege. Courage comes from the heart. And in this moment, her heart was the only thing standing between life and death. The stage was set. The luxurious hospital, the arrogant billionaire, the overlooked nurse, and the child whose life hung by a thread. And in that quiet, tense pause, everyone, whether they realized it or not, was about to witness something extraordinary. The morning calm of St. Catherine's Hospital was shattered by a sudden, piercing alarm. A code blue flashed across the monitors in the pediatric ward. Amara's heart raced. Ethan's condition had worsened far faster than she anticipated. His chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths, and the color of his lips had paled into a near-lifeless shade. "Doctor! Call a doctor now!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the ward. But the response was sluggish. Most of the staff were distracted, trying to accommodate Mr. Harrington, who had started inspecting the hospital's surgical wing with his entourage. "Do something!" Ethan's mother cried, panic flooding her voice. "Please, he's my only son." Amara didn't hesitate. Years of training, countless emergencies, and an unshakable sense of responsibility had prepared her for this moment. She checked Ethan's vitals and quickly realized the diagnosis: severe respiratory distress, and without immediate intervention, he could go into cardiac arrest. Her hands moved swiftly. She adjusted the oxygen mask, elevated his head slightly, and tried to stabilize his breathing. But the monitors beeped faster, warning of impending danger. Meanwhile, in the corridor, Mr. Harrington's booming voice echoed as he complained to a nurse. "Completely oblivious to the emergency in room 12B. This ward is a disaster. Beds not aligned, charts misplaced, and why is the air conditioning fluctuating? Who is responsible for this mess?" he demanded, waving his hand impatiently. His assistant hurried behind him, scribbling notes as if every complaint were a matter of life or death, except the one life that actually was in danger. Amara gritted her teeth. She had no time for the billionaire's theatrics. "Ethan, hold on," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She knew that if she waited for a doctor to arrive, precious minutes would be lost, minutes that could cost a child his life. Her eyes darted around the room. Emergency protocols, medications, oxygen adjustments, everything she needed was there, but acting without explicit doctor authorization could end her career. Yet in that moment, ethics overrode fear. She made a split-second decision. She would save this child, no matter the consequences. With her hands steady but heart pounding, Amara administered a critical dosage of medication, manually monitored his breathing, and carefully adjusted the oxygen flow. Sweat beaded her forehead as she worked, each second dragging by like an eternity. Ethan's small body trembled under her touch, and she whispered encouragements between her controlled, precise movements. Outside, the commotion of the billionaire's entourage grew louder. Mr. Harrington finally glanced toward room 12B, his brow furrowed. He saw Amara kneeling beside a child's bed, her hands moving with deliberate care. "Who authorized this?" he barked, striding toward the door. "What is she doing?" "Step away from the patient!" Amara didn't flinch. He needs help now, sir. If we wait for approval, he won't make it, she said firmly, her voice carrying a mix of authority and desperation. The billionaire laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound that echoed off the marble floors. Do you even know what you're doing? I've built hospitals, invested millions, and you're risking everything over a child nobody cares about? Step back, woman. Amara's jaw tightened. She ignored his arrogance and focused on Ethan. Every muscle in her body was tense, every thought concentrated on keeping him alive. For her, wealth and power meant nothing compared to the fragile pulse of a life hanging by a thread. Minutes felt like hours. The child's breathing remained shallow, and the monitors continued to beep warningly. Nurses and staff watched in stunned silence, some frozen by fear, some secretly admiring her courage, but none daring to intervene. Then, a small sign of hope. Ethan's color began to return, faintly at first, then more steadily as Amara continued her precise interventions. His pulse stabilized and his shallow breaths grew deeper, though still labored. Relief surged through her, but she didn't relax, knowing the crisis wasn't over yet. Mr. Harrington stood frozen, his face pale now, a mix of shock and disbelief overtaking his usual arrogance. He had never seen anyone confront life-and-death stakes with such calm, deliberate courage, especially not someone society had trained him to underestimate. You saved him?" he whispered, almost to himself, unable to mask the astonishment in his voice. Amara met his gaze briefly but didn't answer. Her focus remained on Ethan, who now slowly opened his eyes, recognizing the warm, determined face that had refused to let him slip away. A weak smile crossed the boy's lips, and his mother sobbed, clutching Amara's hands in gratitude. In that moment, the hospital's social hierarchy, the wealth, the status, the arrogance, seemed to vanish. All that mattered was one nurse's courage, one child's life, and the silent lesson that true heroism doesn't need permission. And somewhere in the hallway, Mr. Harrington realized that for all his money, influence, and power, there were things in this world, things like bravery, compassion, and selfless action, that he could neither buy nor command. The fluorescent lights of room 12B flickered faintly as Amara worked tirelessly, her hands steady despite the storm of fear raging inside her. Every second counted, and every movement she made could mean the difference between life and death. Ethan's breathing was still shallow and his tiny body trembled under the strain, but Amara refused to let panic take over. She had faced emergencies before, but nothing like this, where bureaucracy, arrogance, and human error all threatened to claim a life that was now entirely in her hands. The door burst open, and in strode Mr. Harrington, flanked by his assistants and a few curious onlookers. His face, usually composed and confident, was now etched with disbelief. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice echoing harshly off the marble walls. "Why is this child unattended? Who authorized this chaos?" Amara didn't flinch. She straightened slightly but continued her work, keeping one hand on Ethan's chest to monitor his pulse while adjusting the oxygen flow with the other. "He doesn't have time," she said firmly, her voice carrying a calm authority that startled even the billionaire. "If we wait for authorization, he won't survive. I need to act now." Harrington's eyes narrowed. "Act? You mean risk your job and my investment? You think you can just decide on your own what's best?" Amara met his gaze evenly, her tone unwavering. "I'm not deciding on behalf of the hospital or your investments. I'm deciding on behalf of this child's life." A tense silence filled the room. Nurses and junior doctors shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or step back. They knew the rules, knew the protocols, but none of them had the courage Amara had shown. None of them were willing to confront Harrington's wrath. With a deep breath, Amara administered the necessary emergency medication, carefully calculating the dose with precise attention to Ethan's fragile condition. Every movement had to be perfect. Any mistake could be fatal. She whispered words of encouragement to the boy, her voice soft but resolute. "Hang on, Ethan. You're stronger than this. I've got you." Minutes stretched endlessly. Outside, Harrington's entourage exchanged uneasy glances. For once, the billionaire was speechless, witnessing something he couldn't control or manipulate. Amara's courage, her sheer determination, and her unwavering focus left him unprepared. Wealth, power, and influence meant nothing here. The child's chest rose and fell more steadily now. The color began to return to his lips, faint at first, but noticeable. The monitors beeped less frantically. Amara allowed herself a brief sigh of relief, but she didn't stop. She knew the danger wasn't over. You actually knew what to do, Harrington said, his voice a mix of disbelief and grudging admiration. I've never seen anything like this. Amara didn't reply. Her attention remained on Ethan, who now weakly opened his eyes and looked up at her, a small glimmer of recognition and trust shining through his fear. She smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You saved him," his mother whispered, tears streaming down her face.
Thank you.
"Thank you for not giving up." Harrington stepped closer, the arrogance that had defined him for decades now replaced by a silent awe. For the first time, he understood that true power wasn't measured by wealth or influence. It was measured by courage, compassion, and the willingness to risk everything for someone else. The room seemed to shift in that moment. The hierarchy of the hospital, the privilege, the titles, the carefully maintained social order was temporarily irrelevant. What mattered was bravery, humanity, and one nurse's refusal to stand by while a child suffered. Amara finally allowed herself a moment to breathe, her body still tense, her mind racing, but her heart calm with the knowledge that she had done everything she could. Ethan's breathing had stabilized, and color was returning to his face. The crisis, for now, was averted. Harrington, still silent, met Amara's gaze and, for the first time, seemed to see her, not as a nurse, not as someone beneath his notice, but as a human being capable of extraordinary courage. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something unrecognizable. Respect, tinged with shame that he had ever doubted her. The other staff members began to whisper, admiration evident in their tones. Some looked at Amara with newfound respect, while others seemed to reconsider the rigid rules they had followed blindly. One thing was clear. This moment had changed everything in that room. Amara glanced down at Ethan once more, her eyes softening. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. In that quiet declaration, the child's life, her courage, and the silent lesson she had delivered to everyone in the room converged. In saving Ethan, she had risked her career, confronted the billionaire's wrath, and challenged the complacency of those around her. And yet in that moment, nothing else mattered, because she had done what was right, and that was more powerful than any title or fortune. The room was silent, save for the steady beep of Ethan's monitor and the soft, relieved sighs of his mother. Outside, the polished marble corridors of St. Catherine's Hospital buzzed faintly with the distant sounds of hurried staff, but inside room 12B, time seemed to have paused. Everyone present felt the gravity of what had just occurred. Amara straightened, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, but her expression remained calm and composed. Ethan lay back against the pillow, his small chest rising steadily as color slowly returned to his cheeks. The fear that had gripped the room only moments ago began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of awe. Mr. Harrington, the billionaire who had never been humbled in his life, remained frozen at the doorway. His usual air of superiority had vanished completely. He had watched, first with disdain, then with disbelief, and now with an emotion he had rarely allowed himself to feel. Respect. She saved him, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. For the first time in decades, words seemed inadequate to describe what he was witnessing. All his money, all his power, all the influence he had wielded meant nothing compared to the courage and skill of this single nurse. The staff, who had earlier whispered and hesitated, now stepped forward, their admiration evident in their eyes. Nurses exchanged looks, nodding silently to one another, as if to acknowledge a quiet truth. Amara had gone above and beyond, defying the rigid rules, challenging authority, and doing what few had the courage to do. Ethan's mother clutched Amara's hands, tears streaming freely down her face.
Thank you.
"I don't know how to thank you," she sobbed. "You saved my son. You're an angel." Amara smiled gently, brushing a strand of Ethan's hair from his forehead. "He's the brave one," she whispered. "He fought hard, too." Harrington, still standing in the doorway, finally spoke, his voice shaking slightly. I underestimated you," he admitted, the words tasting unfamiliar and awkward on his tongue. "I've never seen anyone act with such determination, with such courage. You risked everything, and yet you didn't falter." For a moment, the billionaire's gaze softened. He looked around the room, at the monitors, the oxygen mask, the IV lines, and then back at Amara. In that instant, he saw her for what she truly was, not just a nurse, not a background figure in his world of power, but a hero. The room seemed to hold its breath as Harrington stepped forward, hesitating. Then, with a nod that carried more weight than any paycheck or contract ever could, he said, "Your bravery? It's extraordinary. I have nothing to say that can match what you've done." Amara allowed herself a small, quiet sigh of relief. She had not acted for recognition, not for praise, not even for the approval of those who wielded power, but acknowledgement, when it came, was a small but satisfying affirmation of what she had risked. Word of her heroism spread quickly through the hospital. Staff members who had doubted her capabilities began to treat her with newfound respect. Even the administrative staff, who had often dismissed her suggestions or ignored her warnings, now looked at her as someone who could not be overlooked. Outside the room, Harrington lingered, still processing what had occurred. For all his wealth, all his experience, he had been powerless to influence the life of one small child. And that truth, shocking as it was, left an indelible mark on him. Amara, meanwhile, knelt beside Ethan once more, ensuring he was comfortable, adjusting the blankets and speaking to him softly. She didn't need accolades. Her reward was in the child's recovery, in the life she had fought to preserve. In the quiet aftermath, the lesson was clear: courage, compassion, and selfless action could command more respect than titles, wealth, or influence ever could. And in that luxurious hospital, amidst the privileged and powerful, one nurse had reminded everyone present that true heroism often came from the most unexpected places. The child smiled weakly, reaching for her hand. Amara squeezed it gently. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it together." And for the first time that day, the billionaire who had scoffed at her presence realized that sometimes the smallest hands could hold the greatest power. The hospital, once a realm of hierarchy and rigid protocol, now seemed transformed. Staff members moved with renewed respect in Amara's presence, nodding silently, offering smiles and subtle gestures of acknowledgement. Word of her courage had spread quickly. The nurse who risked everything to save a child had challenged complacency, arrogance, and privilege, and she had prevailed. Ethan, now sitting up with a bright smile, reached for Amara's hand. His small fingers clasped hers tightly, and in that simple gesture she felt the weight of every sleepless night, every moment of fear, and every risk she had taken. The child's mother hugged her, tears still glistening in her eyes. "You didn't just save his life. You saved our hope," she whispered. Even Mr. Harrington, the billionaire who had once scoffed at her, remained in the room. He looked around, his expression a mixture of disbelief, humility, and awe. For the first time, he realized that his money, influence, and authority could not create true courage. That power belonged to those like Amara, those willing to stand for what was right, even when the world told them they were powerless. "You've shown me something I never expected to see," Harrington said finally, his voice quieter, tinged with respect. "Bravery like yours. It's rare, and yet you acted without hesitation, without seeking recognition. That is true strength." Amara nodded humbly, brushing off the praise. She had never acted for recognition. Her reward was Ethan's life, the child's smile, and the knowledge that she had done the right thing. But she knew this moment would resonate. Far beyond room 12B, it would serve as a reminder to everyone present that courage and compassion are the most powerful forces of all. The hospital slowly returned to its rhythm. But the air had changed. Staff now approached Amara with deference, asking her advice, listening to her guidance, and acknowledging her expertise. Even the administrative staff, who had dismissed her warnings in the past, treated her with respect. She had earned it, not through wealth, not through titles, but through selfless action in the face of danger. As she prepared to leave the ward for a brief break, Amara looked back at Ethan, now smiling at his mother and reaching for a toy. She smiled softly, a quiet satisfaction in her heart. For her, this was the ultimate reward, a life saved, trust earned, and a lesson taught to those who had underestimated her, and to the audience watching this story unfold. Remember, true heroism isn't about status or wealth. It's about the courage to stand up when it matters most, even when the world doubts you. If you were inspired by Amara's bravery, don't just watch, be part of our journey. Hit the subscribe button, share this story with someone who needs a reminder that courage comes in all forms, and comment below where you're watching from. Every like, every share, every comment helps spread stories that inspire and remind us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things, because sometimes the smallest act of bravery can leave the biggest mark on the world.